The autumn morning of October 12, 1987, dawned cold and grey over the small town of Brookfield, Pennsylvania. Fog rolled thick through the valleys, clinging to the bare branches of oak trees that lined Monroe Street. Inside the modest two-story house at number 247, Margaret and Robert Thompson were preparing breakfast when they realized their 9-year-old son, Danny, wasn't in his bed. Margaret checked the bathroom, then the small den where Danny liked to read comic books. Nothing. Robert searched the backyard, calling his name, his voice swallowed by the morning mist. By 7:30, they called the Brookfield Police Department. Danny Thompson had vanished. Before we continue with Danny's story, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring more true stories like this one to light. The investigation began immediately. Chief Harold Bennett, a 30-year veteran of the force, assembled every available officer. They scoured the neighborhood, knocked on doors, questioned neighbors. Danny had last been seen around 6 o'clock the previous evening, playing basketball in the driveway with his older brother Marcus. Marcus, 13 at the time, told police that Danny had gone inside to wash up for dinner, but he never made it to the table. Margaret had assumed he'd already eaten and gone to his room to do homework. The first 48 hours were frantic. Volunteers from the community formed search parties, combing through the woods behind the Thompson property, checking abandoned buildings, drainage ditches, and the banks of Willow Creek that ran through the eastern edge of town. Bloodhounds picked up Danny's scent near the old railroad tracks, about 2 miles from his house, but the trail went cold at the crossing where Route 22 intersected with County Road 15. Margaret appeared on local television, her face pale and drawn, clutching one of Danny's school photos. "Please," she whispered to the camera, tears streaming down her cheeks. "If anyone has seen our boy, if anyone knows anything, please come forward. We just want him home." Robert stood beside her, his jaw clenched, one hand gripping her shoulder so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Tips flooded in. A gas station attendant in nearby Clearfield reported seeing a boy, matching Danny's description, getting into a dark-colored sedan. A woman in Altoona claimed she'd seen him at a bus station. Every lead was investigated. Everyone turned out to be false. Weeks turned into months. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing in behavioral analysts and resources that the small Brookfield department couldn't access on their own. Special Agent Victoria Hayes took charge of the federal effort, coordinating with local authorities and setting up a dedicated tip line. She visited the Thompson home weekly, updating them on the investigation's progress, though there was precious little progress to report. The media attention faded. By Christmas, Danny's disappearance was no longer front-page news. The search parties dwindled to a handful of dedicated volunteers, then stopped altogether. Margaret refused to take down the missing posters she'd stapled to every telephone pole in 3 counties. She drove the same routes every weekend, showing Danny's picture to strangers, asking the same questions she'd asked 100 times before. Robert threw himself into work at the steel mill, taking double shifts to avoid the empty silence at home. Marcus withdrew into himself, carrying guilt that no 13-year-old should bear. He'd been the last family member to see Danny alive, and though nobody blamed him, he blamed himself. Years passed. The Thompson house became a shrine to a boy frozen in time. Danny's room remained untouched, his baseball gloves still resting on the dresser, his bed made with the same Superman sheets he'd slept on the night before he disappeared. Margaret celebrated his birthday every year, baking his favorite chocolate cake with vanilla frosting, lighting candles she would blow out herself when Danny didn't come home. The marriage couldn't survive the loss. Robert moved out in 1992, settling into an apartment above a hardware store in Dubois. He and Margaret spoke only when necessary, their shared grief too heavy to carry together. Marcus left for college in Philadelphia, desperate to escape the shadow that had consumed his childhood. Detective Hayes, who had been promoted to supervisory special agent by the mid-90s, never closed the case file. She kept Danny's photo pinned to her bulletin board, even as she worked dozens of other cases. Something about the Thompson family stayed with her. She'd seen Margaret's hope slowly dim over the years, watched Robert's shoulders bow under the weight of unanswered questions, witnessed Marcus's transformation from a bright teenager into a haunted young man who couldn't meet anyone's eyes. In 1998, a prisoner at the State Correctional Facility in Huntingdon claimed he had information about Danny Thompson's disappearance. Hayes drove 3 hours to interview him. The man, serving 20 years for kidnapping and assault, spun an elaborate story about a trafficking ring operating out of Pittsburgh. Hayes spent 6 months following his leads, only to discover he'd fabricated everything in hopes of getting his sentence reduced. Other investigators came and went. The Brookfield Police Department saw 3 different chiefs between 1987 and 2010. Each one inherited Danny's case file, now grown thick with reports, photographs, witness statements, and dead ends. Each one promised Margaret they wouldn't give up. But as technology evolved and departments shifted resources to newer cases, Danny Thompson became another cold case, another unsolved mystery, another family left without answers. Margaret never stopped searching. She joined support groups for parents of missing children, connecting with others who understood her particular brand of grief. She organized annual vigils on the anniversary of Danny's disappearance, standing at the railroad crossing where the bloodhounds had lost his scent, lighting candles in the darkness. Sometimes 50 people came, sometimes only 5. But Margaret was always there. In 2015, Robert Thompson died of a heart attack while working in his garden. He was 68 years old. At the funeral, Margaret stood beside the casket, dry-eyed and hollow, and whispered, "You can see him now. Tell Danny we're still looking." Marcus, now 41 and working as an accountant in Pittsburgh, held his mother's hand and wondered if the not knowing had killed his father more surely than any heart disease. The breakthrough came in the spring of 2023, 36 years after Danny disappeared. Dr. Lisa Ramanujan, a forensic genealogist working with the DNA Doe Project, was reviewing a list of unidentified remains that had been entered into the national database decades earlier. The organization used advanced genetic genealogy techniques, the same technology that had cracked the Golden State Killer case, to identify unknown victims and missing persons. One entry caught her attention. In November 1987, just 4 weeks after Danny Thompson vanished, the body of a young boy had been discovered in a ravine off Interstate 80, near the town of Brookville, roughly 35 miles from Brookfield. The remains had been badly decomposed, and the technology available at the time hadn't been sufficient to make an identification. The boy had been buried in the county cemetery under a small marker that read simply, "Unknown Child, 1987. Dr. Ramanujan pulled the case file. The estimated age was 8 to 10 years old. The estimated time of death aligned with Danny's disappearance. But what struck her most was the location. Brookville sat along the route between Brookfield and the larger cities to the west. It was exactly where someone traveling on Route 22 or Interstate 80 might have disposed of evidence. She requested a DNA sample from the remains. The sample was degraded, but advances in testing methods meant they could still extract usable genetic material. Dr. Ramanujan uploaded the profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people voluntarily shared their DNA results to find relatives. The AI-powered algorithms went to work, comparing millions of genetic markers, building family trees, identifying distant cousins and relatives who shared fragments of DNA with Unknown Child 1987. Within days, the software had constructed a preliminary family tree. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Ramanujan had narrowed the possibilities to 3 families in western Pennsylvania. One of those families was the Thompsons. Marcus Thompson had submitted his DNA to a commercial ancestry service in 2019, curious about his heritage, never imagining it might someday help identify his brother. When Dr. Ramanujan contacted him in May 2023, he initially thought it was a scam. She explained the process carefully, walking him through the science, the probability calculations, the likelihood that unknown child 1987 was, in fact, Daniel Robert Thompson. The Pennsylvania State Police exhumed the remains for confirmatory testing. This time, they compared the DNA directly to Marcus's sample and to a sample Margaret provided. The results came back in July. It was Danny. Special Agent Hayes, now retired and living in Virginia, received the call from her former colleague. She sat in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, and wept. After 36 years, Danny Thompson was finally coming home. The news reached Margaret on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 74 years old, her hair completely white, her hands gnarled with arthritis. Detective James Kowalski from the Brookfield Police Department delivered the news in person, sitting in the same living room where she'd waited for news that never came, year after year after year. "We found him, Mrs. Thompson," Kowalski said gently. "We found Danny." Margaret didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes and nodded, as if she'd always known this day would come. "Where?" she asked. "Brookville. He's been there all along." The investigation into how Danny died and who was responsible began immediately, though the trail was 3 decades cold. Forensic analysis revealed he'd died from blunt force trauma to the head. The location where his body was found suggested he'd been thrown from a vehicle traveling on the interstate. Police theorized that Danny had been abducted from near his home, possibly by someone in a vehicle who'd offered him a ride or lured him with some pretense. Detectives revisited every suspect they'd interviewed in 1987, checking which ones had died, which were still alive, which had access to vehicles that matched witness descriptions. They cross-referenced criminal databases, looking for similar crimes, patterns that might connect to Danny's death. Several persons of interest emerged, but building a prosecutable case after 36 years proved nearly impossible. Witnesses had died. Memories had faded. Physical evidence had degraded beyond usefulness. In August 2023, Margaret Thompson stood in the Brookfield Cemetery beside a new grave. The headstone read, "Daniel Robert Thompson, 1978-1987, beloved son and brother, forever in our hearts." The small crowd included Marcus, now grey at the temples, several cousins, old neighbours who remembered the frantic search, and Detective Hayes, who travelled from Virginia to pay her respects. A local pastor spoke about faith and loss, about the mercy of finally knowing even when the knowing brought fresh pain. Margaret listened, one hand resting on the casket, finally able to touch her son again after all these years. At the reception afterward, held at the Brookfield Community Center, people approached Margaret with condolences and memories. Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived next door to the Thompsons in 1987, remembered Danny as a cheerful boy who'd helped her carry groceries. Mr. Wilkins, Danny's third-grade teacher, recalled his passion for dinosaurs and space exploration. These small remembrances were gifts, pieces of Danny that time hadn't erased. Marcus pulled Dr. Ramanujan aside, shaking her hand firmly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For 36 years, we didn't know if he'd suffered, if he was still out there somewhere, if we'd failed him by not searching hard enough. Now we know. Now he's home. That's because of you and your work." Dr. Ramanujan explained how the technology worked, how artificial intelligence had analyzed patterns in genetic data that human researchers might have missed, how the combination of traditional detective work and cutting-edge science had finally broken through the barrier of time. Cases like Danny's are why we do this work, she said. Every unidentified person deserves their name back. Every family deserves answers. The story made national news. Boy missing since 1987, identified through AI and genetic genealogy, the headlines read. Reporters interviewed Margaret, who'd spent 36 years hoping, and now sat in her living room, surrounded by photos of the son she'd finally laid to rest. "I always knew I'd find him," she told a journalist from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. "I didn't know when, didn't know how, but I knew. A mother knows." She paused, looking at a framed picture of Danny in his Little League uniform, forever 9 years old. The not knowing was the worst part. Wondering if he was cold, if he was scared, if he was calling for me. Now I know he's at peace. Now I can be at peace too. The technology that solved Danny's case has since helped identify hundreds of other unknown victims and missing persons. The DNA Doe Project, working with law enforcement agencies across the country, has used genetic genealogy to bring closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. The artificial intelligence tools continue to improve, analyzing genetic data faster and more accurately, building family trees that span generations and continents. For Marcus Thompson, the identification brought both relief and renewed grief. He established a scholarship fund at Brookfield High School in Danny's name, awarded annually to a student interested in forensic science. "Maybe something good can come from this," he said at the first scholarship ceremony in 2024. "Maybe Danny's story will inspire others to pursue careers in science and law enforcement to help other families find their missing loved ones." Margaret lived to see the scholarship awarded twice before she passed away peacefully in her sleep in March 2025, at the age of 76. She was buried beside Danny and Robert in the Brookfield Cemetery, the family finally reunited. Detective Hayes attended Margaret's funeral, standing in the rain beside the 3 graves. She thought about the young mother she'd met in 1987, desperate and terrified, and the elderly woman she'd become, patient and determined, never giving up hope, even when hope seemed foolish. Hayes had worked hundreds of cases in her career, but Danny Thompson's had stayed with her, a reminder of why the work mattered, why every missing person deserved someone who wouldn't stop looking. The case remains technically open. The Brookfield Police Department continues to investigate, hoping that advances in technology or a deathbed confession might someday identify Danny's killer. But the mystery of what happened on that foggy October evening in 1987, who took Danny Thompson and why, may never be fully solved. What is solved is the question of what happened to Danny himself. He's no longer missing. He's no longer a question mark, a heartbreaking unknown. He's home, surrounded by family, remembered and mourned and loved. In the end, Margaret got what she'd prayed for every day for 36 years. She found her son. The small town of Brookfield, Pennsylvania, has changed in the decades since Danny disappeared. The steel mill where Robert worked has closed. Many of the families who lived there in 1987 have moved away. But on October 12th each year, someone always places fresh flowers on Danny Thompson's grave. Sometimes it's a former neighbor. Sometimes it's a recipient of the scholarship that bears his name. Sometimes it's a stranger who read about the case and felt moved to honor a boy they never knew. The story of Danny Thompson is a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on the missing, and the remarkable potential of technology to solve mysteries that once seemed unsolvable. It's a reminder that behind every cold case is a family still waiting, still hoping, still searching for answers. And sometimes, even after 36 years, those answers finally come. The impact of Danny Thompson's case extended far beyond Brookfield. In the months following his identification, the DNA Doe Project received a surge in funding and volunteers. Forensic genealogists across the country found themselves inundated with requests from law enforcement agencies hoping to apply the same techniques to their own cold cases. The success story had proven what many in the field had been arguing for years, that the intersection of traditional investigative work and modern genetic technology could unlock answers that had remained hidden for decades. Dr. Ramanujan found herself traveling the country, speaking at law enforcement conferences and training sessions. She explained the methodology to roomfuls of detectives and FBI agents, many of whom had their own Danny Thompsons, cases that had haunted them for years. "The science is remarkable," she told an audience in Chicago in September 2023, "but it only works because someone somewhere cared enough to preserve evidence, to keep records, to never throw away that box of files gathering dust in the basement. Every piece of evidence you collect today might be the key to solving a case 30 years from now." At Brookfield High School, the first recipient of the Daniel Thompson Memorial Scholarship was a 17-year-old named Ashley Rodriguez. Her father had been part of the search parties in 1987, trudging through the woods day after day, calling Danny's name until his voice went hoarse. Ashley had grown up hearing the story, and it had sparked her interest in forensic science. "I want to help families find answers," she said in her scholarship acceptance speech, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I want to be someone who doesn't give up, who keeps searching even when it seems hopeless." The scholarship covered her tuition at Pennsylvania State University, where she enrolled in the forensic science program. By her sophomore year, she was already volunteering with a non-profit organization that helped families of missing persons navigate the complex landscape of DNA testing and genetic genealogy. She carried a small photo in her wallet, a copy of the one that had hung on telephone poles throughout Brookfield in 1987. Danny Thompson, smiling gap-toothed at the camera, forever 9 years old. The investigation into Danny's death, meanwhile, had taken an unexpected turn. In November 2023, Detective Kowalski received a call from a woman in Ohio named Patricia Hendricks. She'd seen the news coverage about Danny's identification and said she had information that might be relevant. Kowalski drove 6 hours to interview her in person. Patricia, 72 years old and battling emphysema, explained that in October 1987 she'd been working as a night clerk at a truck stop just off Interstate 80, near the Brookville exit. She remembered a man coming in around midnight on October 13th, agitated and sweating despite the cold weather. He'd purchased coffee and asked to use the restroom, where he'd spent nearly 20 minutes. When he emerged, his hands were scrubbed red, and there were wet stains on his jeans that looked like he'd tried to wash them in the sink. "I thought it was strange," Patricia said, her voice raspy from years of smoking. "But you see all kinds of weird people working nights at truck stops. I didn't think much of it until the next day, when I heard about them finding a boy's body in the ravine just a few miles down the road." She paused, coughing into a tissue. "I called the tip line back then, told them what I'd seen, but nobody ever followed up. After a while I figured it wasn't important." Kowalski found the original tip report buried in the case file. Patricia Hendricks had indeed called on November 15, 1987, but the lead had been assigned to a deputy who'd been overwhelmed with hundreds of other tips. It had never been properly investigated. Patricia provided a description: white male, early 40s, maybe 5'10", stocky build, dark hair, wearing work clothes and a blue windbreaker with some kind of logo on it. She couldn't remember the logo clearly, but thought it might have been for a construction or utility company. He'd been driving a dark-colored pickup truck, possibly a Ford or Chevrolet from the early 80s. The description matched several persons of interest who'd been questioned in 1987, but one name stood out: Leonard Graves, a maintenance worker for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. Graves had been interviewed twice during the original investigation. He'd lived in Brookfield, worked along Route 22 and Interstate 80, and drove a dark blue 1983 Ford F-150. Neighbors had described him as quiet, keeping to himself, occasionally displaying a temper when drinking. But Graves had an alibi for the evening of October 12th. He'd been at his sister's house in Dubois, helping her move furniture. His sister, Dorothy, had confirmed the story. Investigators had cleared him and moved on to other suspects. Kowalski decided to take another look. He discovered that Leonard Graves had died in 2019, succumbing to liver cancer at the age of 75. But Dorothy Graves was still alive, residing in a nursing home in Punxsutawney. When Kowalski visited her in December 2023, he found a woman whose mind was sharp despite her 83 years. "I need to ask you about your brother Leonard," Kowalski began gently, settling into a chair beside her bed. Dorothy's expression darkened. "I haven't spoken his name in years," she said quietly. "What do you want to know?" "In October 1987, you told police Leonard was at your house helping you move furniture on the evening of October 12th. Was that true?" Dorothy looked out the window, watching snow fall across the nursing home's courtyard. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "No, it wasn't true." The story spilled out, decades of guilt finally finding release. Leonard had called her late that night, frantic, asking her to lie for him, to tell police he'd been with her if anyone asked. He'd promised he hadn't done anything wrong, that he'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time and needed an alibi. Dorothy, who'd always covered for her troubled younger brother, had agreed without asking questions. "I knew," she whispered, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. "Deep down, I knew something terrible had happened, but he was my brother, and I was afraid. Afraid of what they'd do to him, afraid of what people would think of our family." She gripped Kowalski's hand with surprising strength. "That poor mother, that poor family. I've thought about them every day for 36 years. Dorothy provided details she'd never shared with anyone. Leonard had come to her house around 2 in the morning on October 13th, his clothes muddy, his hands shaking. He'd showered, changed into clothes he kept at her house, and left before dawn. A week later, he told her he'd gotten rid of his truck, sold it for scrap. When the news broke about the boy's body being found near Brookville, Leonard had fallen into a dark depression, drinking heavily, lashing out at anyone who came near. "Did he ever admit what he'd done?" Kowalski asked. Dorothy nodded slowly. "Once, he was drunk maybe 10 years ago. He said it was an accident, that he'd offered the boy a ride, that the boy had panicked and jumped for the door while they were driving. Leonard tried to grab him, lost control of the truck, and the boy hit his head. He said he panicked, didn't know what to do, so he drove out to the interstate and—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The story had holes, inconsistencies that suggested Leonard's version wasn't entirely truthful. But it was more than investigators had ever had before. Kowalski compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Patricia Hendricks's original tip, the timeline of Leonard Graves's movements, Dorothy's recantation of the alibi, the physical evidence linking Graves to the crime scene area. The district attorney reviewed the case in January 2024. While they believed Leonard Graves was responsible for Danny Thompson's death, building a prosecutable case against a dead suspect was impossible. The physical evidence had degraded too much for definitive forensic links. Patricia's eyewitness account placed someone matching Graves's description near the scene, but couldn't definitively identify him. Dorothy's testimony about Leonard's confession was hearsay, inadmissible in court even if there'd been someone to charge. But the truth mattered, even without a trial. Detective Kowalski held a press conference in February 2024, standing before cameras and reporters, explaining what the investigation had uncovered. "We believe Leonard Graves was responsible for the abduction and death of Daniel Thompson," he stated clearly. While we cannot bring criminal charges, we can give the Thompson family the closure of knowing who took Danny from them. Marcus Thompson attended the press conference, sitting in the front row, his hands folded in his lap. When reporters asked how he felt about the revelation, he took a long breath before answering. I'm grateful to finally have answers. I'm grateful to Detective Kowalski and everyone who never gave up on finding the truth. As for Leonard Graves, he'll answer to a higher authority than any court could provide. The news brought a mix of reactions throughout Brookfield. Some residents remembered Leonard Graves as a quiet man who'd kept to himself, while others recalled troubling incidents. A domestic disturbance call to his home in 1985, complaints about his aggressive behavior at local bars, rumors of a temper that exploded without warning. In retrospect, the signs had been there, scattered and easy to dismiss individually, but forming a disturbing pattern when viewed together. Dorothy Graves died 3 months after her interview with Detective Kowalski. The nursing home staff said she'd seemed at peace in her final weeks, the burden of her secret finally lifted. She'd requested that her modest estate be donated to the Daniel Thompson Memorial Scholarship Fund. Marcus accepted the donation, telling reporters, "She carried that guilt for 36 years. In the end, she did the right thing. That matters." The resolution of Danny's case had ripple effects across Pennsylvania's law enforcement community. The state police implemented new protocols for preserving evidence in cold cases, ensuring that DNA samples and physical evidence would be properly stored and catalogued for potential future analysis. Several counties allocated additional funding for genetic genealogy investigations, recognizing the technology's potential to solve long-dormant cases. By the spring of 2024, the DNA Doe Project had identified 12 more unknown victims in Pennsylvania alone, using the same techniques that had identified Danny Thompson. Each identification brought closure to a family, answered questions that had lingered for years or decades, allowed loved ones to finally grieve properly and move forward. Dr. Ramanujan established a training program teaching law enforcement personnel and forensic scientists how to effectively use genetic genealogy in their investigations. Ashley Rodriguez, the scholarship recipient, attended one of the training sessions during her junior year at Penn State. She sat in the front row, taking meticulous notes, asking insightful questions that impressed the instructors. After the session, she approached Dr. Ramanujan. "I wanted to thank you," Ashley said. "Not just for identifying Danny, but for showing me what's possible when we combine compassion with science. That's the kind of forensic scientist I want to be." Dr. Ramanujan smiled warmly. "You're already on the right path. Keep asking questions, keep pushing for better methods, and never forget that behind every case is a family waiting for answers." In Brookfield, the annual vigil for Danny Thompson took on new meaning after his identification. What had once been a somber gathering of hope and uncertainty became a celebration of a life cut short but never forgotten, and a testament to the power of perseverance. On October 12, 2024, nearly 300 people gathered at the railroad crossing where Danny's scent had been lost 37 years earlier. Marcus Thompson addressed the crowd, his voice steady and strong. "My brother was 9 years old when he was taken from us. For 36 years we searched for him, never knowing if we'd find answers. Today, because of advances in science, because of people who refused to give up, because of the courage of witnesses who came forward even decades later, Danny rests in peace, and our family has closure." He paused, looking at the sea of faces illuminated by candlelight. But there are still families searching. There are still children, parents, siblings, friends who've gone missing and haven't been found. Let Danny's story remind us that we never stop looking, we never stop hoping, and we never stop fighting for the truth. The crowd released white balloons into the autumn sky, each one representing a missing person still waiting to be found. Ashley Rodriguez, home from college for the weekend, watched them rise and disappear into the darkness. She thought about the career ahead of her, the cases she'd work, the families she'd help. Danny Thompson had been gone for 37 years before science and determination brought him home. How many others were still out there, waiting? The technology continues to evolve. Artificial intelligence algorithms grow more sophisticated, analyzing genetic data with increasing speed and accuracy. Databases expand as more people submit their DNA for ancestry testing, unknowingly providing the genetic breadcrumbs that might someday identify a missing relative or solve a cold case. The same tools that help people discover they're 5% Scandinavian or connect with a third cousin twice removed are also bringing closure to families who've waited decades for answers. Detective Hayes, now fully retired and living near her grandchildren in Virginia, keeps a scrapbook of cases she worked during her career. Danny Thompson's section is the thickest, filled with newspaper clippings, photos and notes documenting the investigation from 1987 through his identification in 2023. She speaks at community events sometimes, sharing Danny's story, encouraging people to report missing persons promptly, to preserve evidence carefully, to never assume a case is too old to solve. The technology available today would have seemed like science fiction when I started this investigation in 1987, she tells audiences. We couldn't have imagined being able to identify someone through the DNA of distant cousins they'd never met. But that's exactly what happened. And it will keep happening as the technology improves. The lesson is simple: never give up. Every case can be solved with the right combination of evidence, persistence, and advances in science. The case files for Daniel Robert Thompson remain in the Brookfield Police Department's archive, now marked as solved. Detective Kowalski visits them occasionally, running his fingers across the thick folders that document 36 years of investigation. He thinks about Margaret Thompson, who died never knowing the name of the man who'd taken her son, but finding peace in finally laying Danny to rest. He thinks about Robert Thompson, who carried the weight of not knowing to his grave. He thinks about Marcus, who built a scholarship fund that will help students pursue careers in forensic science for generations to come. Most of all, he thinks about Danny, a 9-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs and space exploration, who played basketball in his driveway and helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, whose life was cut tragically short on a foggy October evening in 1987. Danny Thompson's story didn't end in that ravine off Interstate 80. It echoed through decades, inspiring technological advances, changing investigative protocols, bringing closure to his family, and ultimately serving as a beacon of hope for every family still searching for a missing loved one. The intersection of artificial intelligence and human compassion solved a mystery that had endured for 36 years. It brought Danny home. And in doing so, it proved that time doesn't erase the obligation to seek truth, that technology can serve justice even across the chasm of decades, and that every person who goes missing deserves someone who will never stop looking for them. In the Brookfield Cemetery, fresh flowers appear regularly on Danny Thompson's grave. The headstone, simple and dignified, marks the resting place of a boy whose disappearance sparked a search that lasted more than 3 decades, and whose identification demonstrated the remarkable power of modern science to answer questions that once seemed unanswerable. Danny Thompson is home. The mystery is solved. And his legacy lives on in every cold case that gets reopened, every unknown victim who gets their name back, every family that finally receives the closure they've desperately sought. The boy who went missing in 1987 has become a symbol of hope, proof that even the oldest cases can yield their secrets when determination meets technology, when people refuse to forget, and when justice, however delayed, finally prevails.